Hello everyone, today we briefly introduce the medieval kingdom of Castile. As you know, we are today talking about all the various historical regions in some detail, and we have hardly ever talked about realms as a whole, right, for our very short introductions. I also made multiple videos about Castile already, and many more about Iberian history. There is really a lot to dig into it, as far as also the Islamic states were concerned. However, the Kingdom of Castile has a centrality in Spanish history for obvious reasons. It's fundamentally the main monarchy that manages to take over most of the Islamic land of the Iberian plateau, and to establish fundamentally stronger power, even though the various Iberian crowns would remain separated well into the modern age, in spite of the dynastic collection, let's say, occurring at the end of the Middle Ages with the Reyes Católicos. We will talk about them now. I also introduced the Kingdom of the Asturias, Leon, and therefore we have already come across Castilian history just in a sort of linear sense from its this northern emanation and expansion that would eventually overwhelm the Islamic south and lead eventually the Reconquista. And we have, I think I made also a video about properly Leonese and Castilian warfare during the High Middle Ages. There is more around that, of course, I forget, but I think that given this basic information can help framing better, and even if in a generic fashion, the history of this country. So we're talking about the Kingdom of Castile, known in Latin as Regnum Castelle. In Old Spanish, that would ring like Reino de Castilla, if I pronounce it correctly, taking the name, as we will see now, from essentially this fortified frontier area that eventually came to be ever more central and important to eventually absorb the same Leon from which it had stemmed, in a political sense, at least as the main power that had initially controlled these areas, and also from previous origins. Castilla is just east of Leon, right, borders Navarre, Aragon, right, part of the Ebro Valley is there practically, so it's not just the, let's say, the further south, especially Toledo, a bit like the cornerstone for the domination of the Iberian plateau. The first reference to the name of Castilla is to be found in the chronicles of Alfonso III of Asturias. This ruler reigned from 866 to his death in 910. This document bearing the name is written in the 9th century. The Al-Andalus Chronicles from the Caliphate of Cordoba provide with another name in Arab that actually doesn't have to do with the Latin etymology of Castellum, Castrum, etc., is Alquila, which is the equivalent, though, that it means castled, right, and it referred to these high plains past the territory of Álava or Araba, right, this historical province of Spain that fundamentally encompasses the Basque country. So it's the very north of Spain, just a few kilometers, a few tens of kilometers from the sea, right? And so we're looking at that sort of layer, right, at last northern frontier avampost of Christendom after the Islamic conquest, and which is part of the reason why this area was also castled, in fact. south of it, you have, in fact, places like Zaragoza that would become targets from the north by the Christians carrying out raids against the Islamic powers in the more fertile areas. We've seen it for multiple videos on northeastern Spain, with how that dichotomy came to be. We weren't talking about Castile, specifically of Navarre, Aragon, Catalonia. And naturally, the history is similar, where you have this very hard-tempered mountaineers that, as primitive and sort of less developed than the Islamic-dominated South, kept pushing and pushing over the generations, and maintaining a higher degree of militarization, managed eventually to break the reins of this enormous Islamic dominion that, however, had its own systemic fragility. So Castile emerges as a mark on the eastern frontier, what was the Kingdom of Asturias. I made a video about this. It was essentially the first Christian political entity established after the Umayyad conquest of Visigothic Spain in 718. So again, we're talking about pretty ancestral land as far as the Reconquista is concerned. And in fact, this area was heavily castled, towered, and so from the Latin castrum, castra plural, you have this name that of the region that, however, was previously known from ancient times as Barduila. Barduila has nothing to do with the etymology of Castile. It fundamentally stems from the Varduli, a name of a tribe that lived in pre-Roman times in this essentially eastern part of the Cantabrian lands. So there is also that degree of sort of raiding continuity, the Cantabrian Gallop, all this stuff. And that would characterize Iberian warfare way before the Carol Farrar tactics, or the riding a la Ineta of the Reconquista, right? It was in many ways, of course, just a Spanish, would say, an Iberian thing historical. In the south of Castile, you have essentially the northern reaches of the so-called Sistema Central, which is one of the main systems of mountain ranges in the Iberian Peninsula, just north of today's capital, Madrid, Spanish capital, Madrid. This land, as you understand, was not particularly populated just per se, but gradually, right, during this push towards the south, it was resettled by inhabitants coming from Cantabria, Asturias, Vasconia, and also from other communities, not necessarily from the north, by the way, of Visigothic and Mozarab ancestry. Of course, the land had remained populated historically by someone. It was a Romance land, both in language and legal customs. So if you want one of the many lands that could have at some point provided with some political concentration, that at this point was not even, say, the main center, where the Asturias were further northwest, eventually would be Leon, and then Castile, just from northwest to southeast in a sort of crescent. So from the first half of the 9th century until the mid of the same, Castile was administered and defended by the rulers of Leon, and it became an ever more important basis to launch raids into the Emirate of Cordoba. Naturally, the most immediate targets were the closest at hand, but as we've seen in other videos, the expeditions were sometimes very long range, and they could inflict serious losses. They could arrive up to Al-Andalus. Of course, also these Christian warriors from the north were regularly hired by Islamic rulers in their various clashes. So This is notorious. Maybe look just at El Cid and his alternation between supporting some Islamic allies from the massacre of some after the conquest of other of some of these communities. Initially, so this is a moment in which Castile fundamentally expands gradually, right? It's in demographics, agriculturally, and most of this slow but constant expansion was carried out primarily, right? Was led, at least administered, rationalized by, as bit like in the guise of high medieval Europe, not differently from the rest of the continent, by the local lay and ecclesiastical authorities, specifically here counts and abbots, right? From the other side of the Cantabrian ridge neighbor valleys. Right? There were different groups mixing in these areas. We have Transmiera, Primorias, also smaller, other smaller areas from this sort of contiguous maritime valleys of Mena and of Encanteri, right, a comarca of the province of today of the province of Biscay, but say close to that at the time, because that's quite on the sea. This is still continental instead, mountainous areas fundamentally that had that more regular need to send people out when whichever unbalance in production or in demographics deemed that, say, made it necessary. Interestingly enough, some of these settlers also came from the south, from those areas of the Meseta highland that had been more exposed to raids. Right, this is a very, say, systemic dynamic all throughout the Reconquista. You have, as the latter comes down, right, successfully, different areas that becoming frontiers, and so altering the settlement dynamics, also the local economics, like shifting from agriculturalism to pastoralism, for example. And these guys from the south had basically thought better to live in those northern areas, right, that as poorer overall, however, they were safer, right, especially, let's say, that were in very impervious parts of northern Spain with intricable woods, right, in the Atlantic valleys that were safer just to establish oneself permanently, and eventually contributing from there to, say, reclaiming the south in part. So it's an extremely complex dynamic. I'm not going today to digress in the depths of this because it deserves another video alone as a thing. But you understand that overall we're talking about Cantabrian Basque areas, right, that came to be swelled with refugees, right, that came under the protection, by the way, of the aforementioned counts and abbots, such as Herbig and Vitelus, brothers in this case, that we know because they registered in the local charters this settlements, and we're talking about the first years of the 19th. Those areas that instead did not extend like particularly far from the Cantabrian southeastern ridges and not beyond the southern reaches of the high Ebro river valleys and canyon gores. This community is essentially stuck to the Cantabrian southeastern ridges. They wouldn't go far beyond the southern ridges of the high Ebro river valleys and canyon gorges. So Castilla was, after all, pretty well enucleated in the core areas from which the power would also politically consolidate. So much so that in the mid-9th century we find the first ruler of sort of more concentrated, in fact, Castile politically. We're talking Ruderick, an influential nobleman of the Asturian kingdom, who, by the way, we think was probably the first Count of Castile. We're not sure, because there may have been somebody else, also of the aforementioned Alava. We know also of Ordoño, the first of Asturias, Alfonso III, that we mentioned before, right? That were the current rulers at the time of Roderick, or Rodrigo, as actually the Spanish term is. The modern one, because the original name was that. Roderick settled and fortified the ancient Cantabrian hill town of Amaya near Burgos, right, west and south of the Ebro River. This was easier to defend from the Islamic military expeditions, by the way, did come at this point somehow regularly, and required the further entrenchment, as we've seen, these various fortifications. Plus, Amaya controlled still the main local Roman highway that passed by, say, south of the Cantabrian Ridge all the way to Leon. This is what made also Castile that well connected eventually to the latter. Ahead, the region is split, right? It's overall like this say individuals like Roderick essentially were recognized as rulers by different counts, but those relative counties, however, in fact, remained somehow autonomous. We have seen it in the video about the Asturias and Leon, etc., how everything is only gradually hegemonized by this or that guy to become something ever more important towards a monarchic direction. We're talking about the counties of Alva, Burgos, Cerezo, and Lantarón. This reduced temporarily what could be seen as politically Castile in an administrative sense. In 931, however, the land was reunified by the Count Ferdinand Gonzalez, who had essentially rebelled to the Leonese kingdom, which had become at that point de facto the successor to the Asturias. And this rebellion granted Castile some sort of autonomous status in the eastern frontier of Leon. Right. It also began at this point, where in the 10th century these areas are, say, somewhat influenced also by the Frankish dynastization and so on, concentration of property, lineage and so on, to allow the inheritance of the count by the house of Gonzalez, and Castile was recognized in the process, and its count appointed by the King of Leon. Naturally, Castile is not central yet, but it, as we've seen, exploits the different dynastic crisis, let's say, so government succession crisis of the Kingdom of Leon. Needless to say, Castile was also more exposed to Navarrese, Zaragozan political influence. For example, during the minority of the Castilian Count Garcia Sanchez, the local communities accepted the rule of Sancho Garces III, also known as Sancho the Great, that was the ruler of Pamplona. We are at the beginning of the 11th century. Sancho married the sister of Count Garcia and became de facto feudal overlord. Right? This pretty mess up things happening, such as the assassination of the Saint Garcia in 1028, when he had gone to Leon in order to marry Princess Sancha, that was the sister of Bermudo the third. So avoiding this power in this case to connect essentially to Leon further. Sancho III appointed at that point his younger son, that having been born by Sancho, so was essentially Garcia's nephew, the future, in fact, the Count of Castile, Ferdinand the First. Right. Ferdinand was married, by the way, to his uncle's intended bride, the aforementioned Sancho of Leon. After Sancho's death in 1035, Castile would return under the Leonese control, temporarily thwarting the Navarrese influence. However, Ferdinand allied himself with his brother, Garcia Sanchez III, right, nicknamed from Nigeria, of Navarre, the king of Pamplona specifically, and started at war with his brother-in-law, Bermudo. At the Battle of Tamaron, taking place on September the 4th, 1037, between Ferdinand and Bermudo. Bermudo was the king of Leon as its third, and the latter was killed, in fact, which also left no surviving heir, so that Ferdinand, in right of his wife, took up the royal title as both King of Leon and Castile. So this is the first instance in which you have Castile and Leon associated into. This doesn't mean that the two territories were just, say, dynastically unified for good. In fact, when Ferdinand died in 1066, as it was the norm among these northern Iberian rulers, the various territories in their possession were distributed to the various children. Right. In this case, Sancho II became King of Castile, Alfonso VI as King of Leon, and Garcia as King of Galicia. Actually, these rulers would be all at different points rulers of all these three lands. What is also interesting is that Ferdinand's daughters were given towns instead for themselves, Urraca, Zamora, and Elvira, Toro. Right? And they essentially exerted Palatine rule over these cities. Right? Sancho II, as King of Castile, allied himself with Alfonso VI of Leon, and together they fought to conquer and then divide Galicia. They, however, turned in the end against one another. Sancho specifically attacked Alfonso and invaded Leon. And here we are at the time of El Cid, that actually participated next to this enterprise next to Sancho. Right? Alfonso was driven into exile, and this allowed, as we were saying, Sancho to rule at this point on all the three kingdoms, which was particularly important because you have Castile, Leon, and Galicia at one altogether. Urraca of Zamora allowed the greater part of the Leonese forces to take refuge in her town, so that Sancho, her brother, led siege to Zamora. However, he ended up assassinated in 1072 by a Galician nobleman known as Belidodolphus, and this brought to the withdrawal of the Castilian troops from Leon. This already tells you how, say, here we are in the 11th century, basically also almost in the 12th, and how escalating the, say, development of these politics had been, and what capacity was already to sort of accumulate enough power to make them act as a wall. right? Some chunks would be lost at some point, some which would make up Portugal, for example. But the sort of broader Castilian power was taking shape, was enucleated in the north already. Alfonso VI, thanks to his brother's demise, was able to recover the original Leonese territory, becoming in turn also King of Castile and Galicia. This was the second union as far as Leon and Castile were concerned. They remained still distinguished realm under personal union, given just, let's say, the local identity, politics, etc. But obviously, they, as I was just saying, they were coalescing into something more concrete. At this point, Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, that is to say, El Cid, El Campeador, took an oath before Alfonso VI in Santa Gadea de Burgos, and say concerning Alfonso's innocence in the matter of his brother, right? And there is all a background now we can't quite digress on, but say arriving in the 12th century, we see the extinction of Alfonso's main line, because Sancho, his only son, died. There was only a daughter of Alfonso, and because of this, Alfonso was still alive, by the way, at the time, so he took another path, right, an international one, right? He married, right, his daughters, actually, to some powerful French rulers. Elvira to Raymond of Toulouse, hell of a name, I made a video about the Count of Toulouse. Urraca to Raymond of Burgundy, and Theresa to Henry of Burgundy. I also made a video about the Duchy of Burgundy. At this point, the coordination between Castile and the rest of Western Christendom was quite intense, for the simple reason that can't quite see now, but say the Islamic world was in Spain was collapsing in terms of political unity, and so the Reconquista was gaining momentum. This also forced, and especially also in order to acquire more power through this international marriage, and not only the ever greater subordination to the papacy. Northern Spain up to some point had maintained the traditional Mozarabic or Hispanic rite. Some call it the Visigothic too, but fundamentally it's what had remained, in fact, from the, say, early medieval Iberian tradition of, say, separation from Rome, and most of revolving around the councils of Toledo. And the papacy imposed the replacement with the Roman rite, by the Roman rite, which of course would have simplified much ecclesiastical matters and given Castile all the support for the Reconquista that was needed. This took place at the Council of Burgos in 1080. Interestingly enough, at Alfonso VI's death, he was succeeded by the widowed Urraca, the one given in marriage to Henry of Burgundy, who now, in fact, married Alfonso I of Aragon. They almost immediately fell out, though. So Alfonso, at that point, Aragon had been forming just in as a realm of its own in the east of Castile, as you know, and there was some sort of important competition, given essentially the Navarre race remained in the mountains, while Aragon kept expanding downwards, and at some point, and also westwards to some degree. These powers had always been deeply intertwined, so much so that Alfonso of Aragon tried, failing though, to conquer Urraca's lands before he repudiated her in 1114. there was Urraca's son from her first marriage, the king of Galicia, that tried to assert his rights over his own mother. And when she died, this ruler that would become Alfonso VII of Castile and Leon took over. Alfonso VII was at this point provided with considerable power, so that he tried in turn to actually expand in the other direction, that is to say, Navarre, Aragon, right? And this was occurring also because after Alfonso I of Aragon's death, there had been substantial problems in the unity of those lands. At this point, you have an interesting option for Castile, that is to say, the possibility simply of arriving to the Mediterranean coast in the east, not from, say, the south, which they would try, in fact, to contend power later on with Aragon itself, and which was not achieved because the latter essentially unified, we've seen it in the video about the Crown of Aragon, with the County of Barcelona, right? With Petronila and Ramon Berenguer IV, which would become, as you know, the true beating heart would become the Crown of Aragon, because that was the most important city on the sea and had quite a drive for a country just like Aragon. Couldn't quite simply now break through further in the west. They didn't have properly manpower to do so. They preferred to connect themselves with Barcelona, and this allowed essentially Aragon to remain an independent kingdom from Castile, and preventing the latter to break through in the east and reaching the Mediterranean. And this is interesting because history could have gone substantially in a substantially different way. Right, could have had some sort of Castilian Aragonese power ante litteram, right, even including Catalonia. Now, this also marked the final channeling of Castilian power towards the north-south axis in the Reconquista struggle. That was just the most obvious political and strategic thing to do, and to bring to the, in fact, Castilian conquest of Toledo. That was the true cornerstone to the control of the entire Iberian Peninsula, and basically constituted the this happened in 1085, the major turning point in the Reconquista, at least in as far as, say, a moment of Islamic preponderance, at least in terms of land controlled, etc. There was a lot about Toledo that embodied also an imperial title of the Castilian rulers, the sense that these were to rule, in fact, over the Christian but also Jewish and Muslim population as protectors of all of them. And there is a specific imperial tradition in Spain that is somehow forgotten, right? But that entailed a sort of universality of the Iberian Peninsula as a system that had, I made a video on specifically, was directly inherited by the same caliphate of Cordoba, and prior to that also the Visigoths had fundamentally tried to do so. The Iberian Peninsula was surely open at this point to the Western world fully, as it was emancipating from this Muslim presence, but it would remain indeed sort of a universe on its own, right? And especially Castile, as we've seen, the leading power, is the most say characteristic of these dynamic, not just because it's the largest country through expansion, but because it is properly the continental part of Spain, like the true heart of that, especially that relentless struggle against the Moors in this enormous plateau, right? That was quite difficult, in fact, to even control, to reconquer from the Muslims. There was a lot of back and forth, the Castilians are the ones that lead the way in this. The centuries of Islamic rule had brought to the Castilian High Plateau to develop towards ship pasturage economically. The fact that the greater part of Spanish ship rearing terminology was derived from Arabic doesn't render much justice to the importance, say, of Castilian, say, wool production, etc. would increase towards the land of the Middle Ages was the greatest producer in Europe, all right, together with southern Italy, England, etc. But it was huge, like comparatively, it was just many times larger than what other countries later on. There is a debate regarding how much Islamic culture had facilitated the spread of different sources, say, especially from the Hellenistic world, because we're told normally, well, the Arabs, but which ones, right? That were, say, thinking, translating, rewriting. Toledo would become, as you know, one of the most important centers for, especially in the 12th century, European translation of Greek, Jewish, Arab texts. The Westerners were basically already literate in these languages when they wanted to know, to search for certain manuscripts, translation, were able to translate that. And they, there are famous names we will see now, which definitely represent this dynamic. They're not even Spanish, right? They were coming from places like England, Italy. And so you understand even the greater prestige of Toledo, given that it was properly the center of this international work of translation. Umayyad Spain, as developed as it was in, say, statally and bureaucratically, so on the wake of the Byzantine Persian models that the Arabs or Arabicized elites were ruling in, was impressive, definitely, compared to the Latin Germanic statal achievement of the time. And of course, the Umayyad Caliphate was originally, say, when we talk about the Spain, the Cordovan one was originally part of the broader one, the one that took control the previously Byzantine and so de facto Hellenized in that area regions of Egypt and Syria in the 7th century. However, aside from the fact that the majority of those who had invaded the Iberian Peninsula were not actually Arabs, they were Berbers from North Africa, the Umayyads were not initially that particularly open to Hellenic to translations or anything that wasn't actually connected with the Quran. And don't get me wrong, when they conquered Egypt and other places, they did treasure, especially the rulers, this important libraries. They were aware of power could derive from that. But let's say in Umayyad Spain there wasn't much of a translating activity. It's only later on, by Abbasid influence, that there was an intense work of translation that reached also the Islamic Spain. When you look at also the dynamics of the 7th to the 8th century, you realize that most knowledge of Greek as a language during Umayyad rule was gained from Byzantine scholars that had remained in those lands rather than an active Islamic translation, dissemination of texts. All right, people suggest that it may have been bigger because the 7th and the 8th century are not particularly well documented ones, but there is a legitimate doubt that at the time, in fact, this major work of just knowledge spread was that sort of thriving, because it wasn't technically happen anywhere. In Abbasid times, you have definitely, and especially under Al-Mansur, and by his orders, translations from different languages, Greek, Syriac, Persian, and Syriac and Persian books themselves were at times essentially translations from Greek or Sanskrit, right? So there was a massive cultural legacy coming at that point through these works, from the same, Zoroastrian Sasanian times, Khosroes, the first age of cultural development, and in the process, right, all these works reached Europe, paradoxically not from the east, right, because the Byzantine Empire was in the way, but from passing through North Africa and reaching Spain. There was a major basin of reception of these works, right? It was, of course, now we can't quite. I made videos regarding this cultural influences between the Caliphate of Cordoba and Abbasid Baghdad, right? It was Egypt in between. There were different schools of Islamic law from Arabia, etc. Some strange correspondences in the Islamic world, even from between regions were very far away, but that somehow got the same, in fact, school of law and juridical tradition. And we do know that all this stuff circulated. We've seen it even in the videos about general warfare, history of warfare, all the various sort of Islamic-looking arms and armor that you find in Iberian and also even Christian Iberian archaeology and iconography. So Toledo, in spite of the fragmentation of the Cordoban Caliphate into the taifas, and so the general political weakening, was flourishing culturally, right? And when the Christians conquered, of course, it opened to Western Europe an enormous amount of Arabic classics, collecting this enormous Hellenistic, Persian, and far beyond cultural legacy, right? We have very famous names such as Daniel of Marley, right? An English scholastic philosopher and astronomer. Gerard of Cremona. I made a video about Cremona just recently, by the way. This guy was an Italian translator of scientific books, specifically from Arabic to Latin. So just think about these individuals that literally came just respectively from their own countries. They were not influenced by Islamic culture in any direct way, but were literate in those languages enough and to specifically go search in Toledo the manuscripts to translate, because their countries had already been developing the science and the philosophy needed for going to search, but also knowing in advance where they could find these ancient works, right, of classical antiquity. From the translations could derive from Arabic, and also from the same Greek, actually, from, let's say, Greek texts, Jewish texts, for example. And well, Castile was the protagonist of all this, even though the country took up a substantially feudal, pastoral, continental outlook, right? But there were these important centers further south up to the Al-Andalus, whereas we would see the Castilians broke into, and so the Castilian monarchy would develop on the basis of this, urban culture with Mozarabic or Mudéjar tradition, and this vast estates and just pastoral areas, etc. And there was some diversification, right, of the economy, but never as much as, especially the northeast of Spain. There was much more commercially, maritime oriented, just even for obvious reasons. And there are so many different actual issues going on here regarding the conquest of the various taifas and fundamentally the competition between the various Iberian monarchies that eventually slowed down, let's say, not much the Reconquista that ended with Las Navas technically, but with the further completion of the Christian conquest of the entire Iberian Peninsula, just because of these wars. Within Castile, of course, there was the kingdom, the famous Way of St. James, right? This massive network of pilgrims' ways, or pilgrimages, simply leading to the shrine of the Apostle James in the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela in Galicia, northwestern Spain, that had become, in fact, the main Christian Iberian sanctuary. It had been in part spared from destruction by the same Almanzor that had it was in the last the last expeditions of Islamic Cordoba towards the Christian north. And that was just like what we were saying before, aimed at from both sides to win over the support of the local infidels, in a way or another, just as becoming the protectors of those who would conquer initially. This would be obvious, especially in the heat of the Reconquista, because you had to win over the communities and gaining the decisive moral support in order to win. Then, when things consolidated, and as we will see now, notoriously, there was a significant purge, forced conversion, and more. In any case, the Way of St. James further enhanced the cultural exchange between the kingdoms of Castile, Leon, with the rest of Europe, Western Europe specifically, and contributing to the further, in fact, Francization, you can say, feudalization of the country. Another important feature of the Iberian Reconquista, as you know, is the establishment of monastic military orders, and Castile was on the forefront for the aforementioned reasons. Calatrava, Alcantara, Santiago, these were all important monastic military orders founded in Castile or Leon, and or in Galicia. These were, in fact, the three respectively. And this was, of course, first of all, a matter of we can't quite. I made videos about the monastic military order, so you know what we're talking about in general. And it's obvious that this such huge frontier, the necessity of having some top-notch, spiritually indoctrinated and excellently trained, right, knights / monks was fundamental in the struggle. The Muslims had the Marabutins, etc. We saw that in the video about the Almohads, the Almoravids. The Castilian rulers also pressed for the foundation of many Cistercian abbeys, so agglutinating further their country through the work of this branch from the Benedictines, right? That represent really the hard workers, the white monks, right? That really changed the face of medieval Europe in terms of deforestation, reclamation, and given this more orderly administration to a feudal world, that was directing all this from the top and rationalizing the economical activities. In the 13th century, the practice of dividing the kingdom among the sovereign children was still alive. In fact, this happened with the same sons of Alfonso VII that we talked about before. For example, Sancho III became King of Castile, while Ferdinand II, King of Leon. All right, and indeed there was competition between the two two kingdoms, because these were technically, as we've seen with Kingdom of Leon properly two separated kingdoms. Doesn't matter that Castile would gradually absorb, because it was expanding for much south, so it was becoming ever more powerful in terms of reconquest acquisitions, and the north was, say, just less developed. Also, with the Castilians were actively building further in the south. And in 1230, you have a final resettlement when Ferdinand III of Castile received the Kingdom of Leon from his father Alfonso IX, that had, and having previously received the same Kingdom of Castile from his mother Berenguela of Castile in 1217. So various, say also female inheritance, for example, bringing to this various splits, but there was a recomposition. These are the years under Alfonso IX, which the Almohad Empire of Islamic Berbers that had reinjected some power in the Muslim effort on the peninsula was actually declining and was conquered by the Castilians, who occupied the Guadalquivir Valley. We have been talking about Alfonso X recently. I'm actually planning to make another video soon. He took, at this point, the Taif of Murcia, reaching fundamentally the Mediterranean in the southeast, also creating some problems with the Aragonese, because that area was being contended, like it was pretty far from both sort of centers of power, but this made it more difficult to keep together, just to you have intermittent control over this areas. Both sides eventually would reach a settlement. I made a video about the Kingdom of Valencia that explains that a little bit in depth. They're gradual conquests, right? They do not take place that quickly before 1212, that is Las Navas, when the joint Christian forces managed to properly to crush the Al-Andalus, and de facto making Castilla having a centrality in this. All the remaining Islamic rulers on the peninsula, subjects, vassals. This is what actually ended the Reconquista, not the conquest of Granada in 1492. Right? Ideally, of course, the struggle continued in that sense, but Christian rule was hegemonic at this point. And remember what I said about Toledo and the protection over the Jews and the Muslims initially for Iberian rulers. It was actually, there were vast Mudayyar, that is either Muslim or Jewish communities within these countries. Right? At some point, even, I don't know, up to 40% places, like, if I'm not wrong, the same Kingdom of Valencia, for example, but even further north. The course from Leon and Castile merged in the 13th century. This moment is considered the foundation of the crown of Castile as such, because they weren't reasoning as two separated kingdoms, but as just both under a single crown of some sort. So you have Castile, that now has become central, plus Leon, and the newly conquered Islamic taifas, including the one of Cordoba, the most prestigious, important. This was the former capital of the Caliphate. Then you have the Taifa of Jaén, right, center in Al-Andalus, the Taifa of Seville, further south towards the Gibraltar Strait, and you have a gradual Castilian consolidation, in fact, also on the Atlantic watershed. Castile, I made one of my very early videos was about the Castilian fleet, and let's say we just said how continental of a power Castile was. But aside from the northern shores of the Iberian Peninsula, where these rulers could send forces in the struggle between England and France, according to political convenience. There was gradually in the 14th century the opening of the Atlantic route by the Genoese that were settled in Seville, which was prospering, right, and from which a great deal of exploration of the Atlantic would start from these Italian sailors, and becoming the basis of consistent Castilian power. There is also the issue of the Straits. Ferocious wars ensued with the Moroccans, with the Islamic powers that had remained that were in Africa, but counted on coming back into Spain or supporting the local Muslim powers. I made multiple videos about this, but we will come back on it a bit more in depth at some point. One of the most important, the macroscopic dynastic issues in Castilian history is the rule of the Trastamara dynasty from 1369 to 1504. This was ruling also in Aragon from 1412 to 1516, Navarre from 1425 to 1479, and Naples from 1442 to 1501. This name stemmed from the county slash duchy, because it varied over time, of Trastamara, in fact. It was a name used by, for example, Henry II of Castile, the first king of Castile and Leon, in fact, from this specific house. This was used of the Mercedes before coming to the throne in 1369. He had been battling against his half-brother Peter the Cruel after many rebellions, and he managed to affirm his own power. To the new house. John II of Aragon, too, was ruling, right, as such, from 1458 to 1479. And upon his death, his daughter, we have this female succession in Spain, sometimes daughter Eleanor is Queen of Navarre, while his son Ferdinand, King of Aragon, and he is the famous Rey Catholic. In fact, Ferdinand married with Isabella I of Castile, Isabella the Catholic. And in 1469, at the Palacio de los Viveros in Valladolid, that was the ancient capital of Castile, the current capital of Castile, began this union would change essentially the face of Europe forever. You have still two distinguished kingdoms, but they're united in a family. Ferdinand and Isabel became mostly famous as the Catholic monarchs, right, marking the de facto unification of Spain. Los Reyes Católicos were still maintaining their own prerogatives as far as their personal, inheritance were concerned. But from this moment onwards, like the two major crowns remained side by side. Isabella succeeded her brother as Queen of Castile, and Ferdinand became King of Castile Jure Uxoris, right, in 1474. 5 years later, 1479, you have, for the first time in history, at least since the 8th century, a single political unity referred to as España, right, Spain. Of course, the name was already around, but what had happened is that Ferdinand succeeded his father as King of Aragon, and so in practice the personal union between the two crowns was formally achieved, right? The Catholic kings were, reinforcing that sort of statehood, right? They diminished, for example, the power of the nobility, but they also kept the bourgeoisie down. Made a video explaining how in the major Western feudal monarchies, essentially the process of oligarchization was accomplished. Spain had always had this tendency to sort of feudal order, for reasons we can't simply explain now, but it have to do with the way that the country had passed from antiquity in the Middle Ages, the distribution of wealth. But it could be changed, right? The preeminence of Castile was the one of this between this sort of large as landowners, right? Of pastoral economy in some areas, and so it was a very feudal land, and also a militarized one, considering that it had carried out most of the effort of the Reconquista. The Catholic kings were so powerful just by the sum of these two major chunks of European realms that they managed to reduce significantly the powers of the Cortes, so the general courts, the legislative chambers of Spain, to the point that they became sort of the pawn of the monarchs, could simply enact the various laws that were required. The nobility was co-opted historically. It had been creating problems. There was no way essentially to rule without them, of course, and without, of course, the Cortes themselves, that represent different estates of the kingdom. After all, the church was very powerful, to say the least. There had been a very deep, if you look at Isabel, sort of this devotion towards the Catholic papal Reconquista, because of course there wasn't much of an excessive papal interference in Spain because it was distant and somehow sheltered, especially Castile as the main power, so there were lots of things that were moving on their own, and really Spain is a system on its own. The Castilians were also the facto the conquerors of the last Moorish state of Granada in 1492, quite a year, given that thanks to the same Catholic kings, Columbus was landing in America in the same year. Of course, there were other forces. We will make a video about the siege of Granada. That is one of the major military operations in those years in Europe. But the territory was to be annexed by Castile. And with that, you have truly the last Islamic rule in Iberia ending. So if you want, from a moral point of view, the Reconquista to truly finish. And then you have a considerable phase of homogenization of the country. Also, think about the edict on the limpieza de sangre, the blood purity, the forced conversions of the Jews and the Muslims. And actually, the Mudeyyars would maintain a great importance in the country during the Renaissance as well. The rebellions from their side, they couldn't be dislodged simply at times. And so this added still to the political turmoil of the country. But overall, also one of the most important events in the early modern age that you can connect to the end of the medieval, as the last medieval event, is the succession of Joanna, the daughter of Isabella of Castile, as queen in name, right, after her mother's death in 1504. Her marriage with Philip I of Habsburg, that was de facto the ruler at that point, and you know how that marriage had been brokered, the union of say the Habsburgic succession to Spanish rule fundamentally. After Philip I's death, to whom Joanna, as you know, was particularly attached, let's say, in a morbid way to Ferdinand. Her father, Ferdinand II, was regent. He had tried different successions, right? The problem is that Joanna had already been manifesting symptoms of, at least what were perceived at the time, as mental illness. And at that time, her son, Charles I, was only 6 years old. I just started a series on the Habsburgs. If you're interested, you can search for around this time. Ferdinand II died in 1516, so that at that point you have Charles I being proclaimed as King of Castile and Aragon in authority, so de facto, while, however, his mother, Joanna, as the Queen of Castile, even though living as a recluse and basically almost never seeing her son, was still in name the Queen of Castile, right? So de facto, Charles I became, given that his parents-in-law were still maintaining their own respective kingdoms, and even his mother, to some point, had heard that the fact of the, but I'd heard that formally, but before the fact of the first ruler of Castile and Aragon together fully, right? So you can conceive Charles as the true first king of Spain, right? As also Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire that he became in 1519, predating. But the Spanish rule predated even the Holy Roman Imperial one, given say the succession to his grandfather to the imperial, at least in the imperial election, and then from his mother's side, the Spanish inheritance. That was also the most powerful overall, right? Considering how the empire was governed and how instead Spain, as a Western European feudal monarchy, just like England and France, had substantially affirmed itself, even if with this still separate distinction of the various crowns. One of the most sort of stately built and feudally built countries. Right, today we didn't talk about the emergence of Portugal, which is, however, particularly relevant, and I already discussed in other videos. So if you're interested in Portuguese history and how fundamentally Portugal emerged as a country just from a county belonging to the realm of the Castilians. Well, you can check those videos out. And of course, the history today I made it very, very, very simple, right? But the history of the country is particularly complicated as far as the various annexations of different countries, for example, Navarre in the 16th century, etc. But also other issues such as as we've seen the very gradual conquer of taifas of Murcia, Jaén, Seville, Córdoba. You have this taifas sometimes going back and forth. You have the War of Succession of 1296, the reincorporation of Leon in 1301. There is the rebellion in Galicia in 1361, the subjugation 2 years later of Saint Land, but the loss of 1386, and the resubjugation of 88. So it's quite complex. We can't quite talk about this so simply, right? But when you look at great names like Alfonso X, you're always appreciating here a massive system, right? That was particularly as such difficult to keep together, but that would still manage to consolidate as somehow typical, but also peculiar type of feudal national monarchy, right? And for all the details, of course, we have to talk about that in other videos. I say it all the time because it seems that you talk about the Kingdom of Castile. There are so many ways you can talk about this, right? So we go step by step, gradually covering everything. We can conclude just by noticing, say, the heraldry of Castile, which, aside from the canting arms of Leon, because Castile and Leon actually just the Castilian ones include a three-towered castle, amazing sable, and azure azur, right, with gules. And this is something at some point we will see also in the heraldry of the Iberian Peninsula that I think I made a video back in the day about this already, but I have to re-upload it with Creative Commons pictures, right? Because you have it, but it's blurred, and it's not just about it's about the Reconquista rather, in the later Middle Ages. So you find also Islamic banners and so on. But again, we'll do likely I think something more in depth about this precisely. For today, however, I stop it here. We will hopefully keep on talking about Castilian history soon. I just stop it here for today. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.